In Victoria-era Britain, a court case divided opinions in households like no other. It would have read like the plot of a Dickens novel if it hadn't been a true story. It was a case of a baronet who'd been thought lost at sea. He, however, returned to try and claim his title, and a great trial took place. This is the story of the Tichborne case. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. And I'm excited to tell you, this is the first two-part story, and the concluding part next week. If you prepare to binge, then you might want to stop now and listen next week to both episodes. I also plan to have a 3-part episode to end this current series, where we look at the crooked life of Jonathan Wild, the thief-taker of 18th century London, and the inspiration for Moriarty and the Sherlock stories. Now, you might need a nice warm cup of coffee or tea for the next part. Social ranking has historically always played a part in British society, and we see this nowhere more clear than in Pride and Prejudice, where we see the 16-year-old Lydia displacing her older sisters Jane and Elizabeth in the family ranking by virtue of her marriage. This, and indeed British nobility and ranking, for some is the ultimate act of snobbishness. For others, perhaps they've watched it on The Crown and they're fascinated by it. For the nobility, rank is important as it affects their place at royal court, seating, and invitations to events. Let's take a cursory look at nobility ranking, which has its own system. The lowest to the highest. A baron, a baroness, a viscount, a viscountess, an earl, a countess, a marquis, a marchioness, a duke, a duchess. Then we would move on to royalty, with the royal dukes. The best example would be that current royal pariah, the Queen's son, Andrew, the Duke of York. Then we have princes and princesses, and then the Queen's consort, and we think of the recently deceased Prince Philip. And lastly, and currently, the Queen. It should be noted that many members of the royal household have numerous titles. And I hear you ask, where lords and ladies come into the equation? It should be noted that barons, viscounts, earls, marquis, and their female counterparts can be referred to as lords and ladies, and many will use that title in less formal situations, and indeed everyday life. A baronet, which is the subject of today's tale, fits in slightly below the above nobility and between knights of the realm. They aren't lords, rather they have a prefix of Sir. And to clarify where knighthoods fit in, they're the most common title, and we see many of them given to commoners who have done something special in their field of expertise, and we think of people like Sir Elton John, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Sir Andy Murray. These types of titles, however, last for their lifetime, and unlike many other titles, does not pass down generations. Approximately 1,300 are announced twice a year. This is on the Queen's birthday and the New Year's honours list. And should our beloved Queen listen to this podcast and thinks, "How can one reward that commoner who does those entertaining shows?" Well, I can think of one. Indeed, Your Majesty just needs to get in touch via the email or the Twitter group, the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. And for those of you who wondered, why didn't he go into acting? I think you've just had your answer. And that concludes today's TED Talk. Collect your certificates at the door. Genealogy was once the reserve of the rich and famous, but tracing your family history back hundreds of years is a path being explored by more and more people across the world. And in order to gain an understanding for today's episode, we start by following the family tree. So, sit back, relax, enjoy your tea, and let's begin. The Tichbornes of Tichborne Park, near Ayersford in Hampshire, were an old English Catholic family who'd been prominent in the area since before the Norman conquest of the 11th century. After the Reformation in the 16th century, although one of their number was hanged, drawn and quartered for complicity in the Babington plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, the family in general remained loyal to the crown, and in 1621 Benjamin Tichborne was created a baronet for services to King James I. By 1803, the lineage had reached the 7th baronet, Sir Henry Tichborne, who was captured by the French in Verdun during the Napoleonic Wars and detained as a prisoner for some years. With him in captivity was his fourth son James and a nobly born Englishman, Henry Seymour of Noyle. Despite his confinement, Seymour managed to conduct an affair with the daughter of the Duc de Bourbon. As a result of this love affair, she bore a daughter, Henriette Félicite, who was born in 1807. Years later, when Henriette had passed her 20th birthday and remained unmarried, Seymour thought his former companion, James Tichborne, would make a suitable husband, although James was closer to Seymour's own age. The couple were married in August 1827, and in January 1829, Henriette gave a birth to a son, Roger Charles Doherty Tichborne. Sir Henry had been succeeded in 1821 by his eldest son, Henry Joseph, who fathered 7 daughters but no male heir. As baronetcies are inherited only by males, when Henry Joseph died in 1845, the immediate heir was his younger brother Edward, who had assumed the surname of Doherty as a condition of a legacy. Edward's only son died in childhood, so James Tichborne became next in line, and after him, Roger. After Roger's birth, James and Henriette had 3 more children, 2 daughters who died in infancy, and a second son, Alfred, born in 1839. The marriage was unhappy, and the couple spent much time apart, he in England, she in Paris with Roger. As a consequence of his upbringing, Roger spoke mainly French, and his English was heavily accented. In 1845, James decided that Roger should complete his education in England and placed him in the boarding school, Stonyhurst College, where he remained until 1848. In 1849, he sat the British Army entrance exams and then took a commission in the 6th Dragoon Guards, in which he served for 3 years, mainly in Ireland. When on leave, Roger often stayed with his uncle Edward at Tichborne Park, and he became attracted to his cousin, Catherine Doughty, 4 years his junior. Sir Edward and his wife, although they were fond of their nephew, did not consider the marriage between first cousins desirable. At one point the young couple were forbidden to meet, although they continued to do so clandestinely. Feeling harassed and frustrated, Roger hoped to escape the situation through a spell of overseas military duty, but it became clear that the regiment would remain in the British Isles, and he resigned his commission. On the 1st of March, 1853, he left for a private tour of South America on board La Pauline, a ship bound for Valparaiso in Chile. On the 19th of June, 1853, La Pauline reached Valparaiso, where letters informed Roger that his father had succeeded to the baronetcy, Sir Edward having died in May. In all, Roger spent 10 months in South America, accompanied in the first stages by a family servant, John Moore. In the course of his inland travels, he traversed the route between Valparaiso and Santiago. Moore, who had fallen ill, was paid off in Santiago, while Roger travelled to Peru, where he took a long hunting trip. By the end of 1853, he was back in Valparaiso, and early in the new year, he began a crossing of the Andes. At the end of January, he reached Buenos Aires, where he wrote to his aunt, Lady Doughty, indicating that he was heading for Brazil, then Jamaica, and finally Mexico. The last positive sightings of Roger were in Rio de Janeiro in April 1854, awaiting a sea passage to Jamaica. Although he lacked a passport, he secured a berth on a ship, the Bella, which sailed for Jamaica on the 20th of April. On the 24th of April, 1854, a capsized ship's boat bearing the name Bella was discovered off the Brazilian coast, together with some wreckage but no personnel, and the ship's loss with all hands was assumed. The Tichborne family were told in June that Roger must be presumed lost, although they retained a faint hope, fed by rumours that another ship had picked up survivors and taken them to Australia. Sir James Tichborne died in June 1862, at which point, if he'd been alive, Roger would have become the 11th baronet, but as he was then presumed dead, the title passed to his younger brother Alfred, whose subsequent financial recklessness brought about near bankruptcy. Tichborne Park was vacated and leased to tenants. But encouraged by a clairvoyant's assurance that her elder son was alive and well, in February 1863, Roger's mother, Henriette, now Lady Tichborne, began placing regular newspaper advertisements in the Times offering a reward for information about Roger Tichborne and the fate of the Bella. None of these produced results. However, in May 1865, Lady Tichborne saw an advertisement placed by Arthur Cubitt of Sydney, Australia, on behalf of his Missing Friends agency. She wrote to him, and he agreed to place a series of notices in Australian newspapers. These gave details of the Bella's last voyage and described Roger Tichborne as of a delicate constitution, rather tall, with very light brown hair and blue eyes. A most liberal reward would be given for any information that may definitely point out his fate. In October 1865, Cubitt informed Lady Tichborne that William Gibbs, a lawyer from Wagga Wagga, geographically between Sydney and Melbourne, had identified Roger Tichborne in the person of the bankrupt local butcher, using the name Thomas Castro. During his bankruptcy examination, Castro had mentioned an entitlement to property in England. He had also talked of experiencing a shipwreck and was smoking a briar pipe which carried the initials RCT. When challenged by Gibbs to reveal his true name, Castro had been reticent but eventually agreed that he was, indeed, the missing Roger Tichborne. Henceforth, he became known as the Claimant. Cubitt offered to accompany the supposed lost son back to England and wrote to Lady Tichborne requesting funds. Meanwhile, Gibbs asked the claimant to make out a will and write to his mother. The will incorrectly gave Lady Tichborne's name as Hannah Francis and disposed of numerous non-existent parcels of supposed Tichborne property. In the letter to his mother, the claimant's references to his former life were vague, but were enough to convince Lady Tichborne that he was her elder son. Her willingness to accept the claimant may also have been influenced by the death of her younger son, Alfred, in February. In June 1866, the claimant moved to Sydney, where he was able to raise money from banks on the basis of a statutory declaration that he was Roger Tichborne. The statement was later found to contain many errors, although the birth date and parentage details were given correctly. It included a brief account of how he had arrived in Australia, he and others, from the sinking Bella. He said he'd been picked up by the Osprey, bound for Melbourne. On arrival, he'd taken the name Thomas Castro from an acquaintance from Millipila and had wandered for some years before settling in Wagga Wagga. He had married a pregnant housemaid, Mary Ann Bryant, and taken her child, a daughter, as his own. A further daughter had been born in March 1866. Whilst in Sydney, the claimant encountered two former servants of the Tichborne family. One was a gardener, Michael Guilfoyle, who at first acknowledged the identity of Roger Tichborne, but later changed his mind when asked to provide money to facilitate the return to England. The second, Andrew Bogle, was a former slave at the Duke of Buckingham and Chandoss's plantation in Jamaica, and had thereafter worked for Sir Edward for many years before retiring. The elderly Bogle did not immediately recognise the claimant, whose £189 or 86 kg weight contrasted sharply with Roger's remembered slender build. However, Bogle quickly accepted that the claimant was Roger and remained convinced until the end of his life. On the 2nd of September 1866, the claimant, having received funds from England, sailed from Sydney with his wife and children in first class. Good living in Sydney had raised his weight on departure to £210 or 95 kg, and during the long voyage he added another £40 or 18 kg. After a journey involving several changes of ship, the party arrived at Tilbury on the 25th of December 1866. After depositing his family in a London hotel, the claimant called at Lady Tichborne's address and was told she was in Paris. He then went to Wapping in East London, where he inquired after a local family named Orton. Finding that they had left the area, he identified himself to a neighbour as a friend of Arthur Orton, who, he said, was now one of the most wealthiest men in Australia. The significance of the Wapping visit would only become apparent later. On the 29th of December, the claimant visited Aylesford and stayed at the Swan Hotel, where the landlord detected a resemblance to the Tichbornes. The claimant confided that he was the missing Sir Roger, but asked that this would be kept secret. He also sought information concerning the Tichborne family. Back in London, the claimant employed a solicitor, John Holmes. He agreed to go with him to Paris to meet Lady Tichborne. This meeting took place on the 11th of January at the Hotel de Lille. As soon as she saw his face, Lady Tichborne accepted him. At Holmes's behest, she lodged with the British Embassy a signed declaration formally testifying that the claimant was her son. She was unmoved when Father Charlton, Roger's childhood tutor, declared the claimant an imposter and she allowed Holmes to inform the Times in London that she recognised Roger. She settled an income of £1,000 a year on him and accompanied him to England to declare her support before the more sceptical members of the Tichborne family. The claimant quickly acquired significant supporters. The Tichborne's family solicitors, Edward Hopkins, accepted him, as did J.P. Lipscomb, the family doctor. Lipscomb, after a detailed medical examination, reported that the claimant possessed a distinctive genital malformation. It was later to be suggested that Roger Tichborne had this same defect, but it could not be established beyond speculation and hearsay. Many people were impressed by the claimant's seeming ability to recall small details of Roger Tichborne's early life, such as the fly fishing tackle he had used. Several soldiers who had served with Roger in the Dragoons, including his former batman, Thomas Carter, recognised the claimant as Roger. Other notable supporters included Lord Rivers, a landowner and sportsman, and Guildford Onslow, the Liberal MP for Guildford, who became one of the claimant's staunchest advocates. By mid-June 1867, the claimant's weight had reached almost £300, or 140 kg, and would increase even more during the ensuing years. Despite Lady Tichborne's insistence that the claimant was her son, the rest of the Tichbornes and their related families were almost unanimous in declaring him a fraud. They recognised Alfred Tichborne's infant son, Henry Alfred, as the 12th Baronet. Lady Doherty, Sir Edward's widow, had initially accepted the evidence from Australia, but changed her mind soon after the claimant's arrival in England. Lady Tichborne's brother, Henry Seymour, denounced the claimant as false when he found that the latter neither spoke nor understood French, Roger's first language, as a child, and lacked any trace of a French accent. The claimant was unable to identify several members of the family and complained about attempts to catch him out by presenting him with imposters. Vincent Gosford, a former Tichborne Park steward, was unimpressed by the claimant, who, when asked to name the contents of a sealed package that Roger left with Gosford before his departure in 1853, said he couldn't remember. The family believed that the claimant had acquired from Bogle and other sources information that enabled him to demonstrate some knowledge of the family's affairs, including, for example, the location of certain pictures in Tichborne Park. But despite all these objections, as long as Lady Tichborne was alive and maintaining her support, the claimant's position remained strong. On the 31st of July 1867, the claimant underwent a judicial examination at the Chancery Division of the Royal Courts of Justice. He testified that after his arrival in Melbourne in July 1854, he had worked for William Foster at a cattle station in Gippsland under the name Thomas Castro. While there, he had met Arthur Orton, a fellow Englishman. After leaving Foster's employment, the claimant had subsequently wandered the country, sometimes with Orton, working in various capacities, before setting up as a butcher in Wagga Wagga in 1865. On the basis of this information, the Tichborne family sent an agent, John Mackenzie, to Australia to make further inquiries. Mackenzie located Foster's widow, who produced the old station records. These showed no reference to Thomas Castro, although the employment of an Arthur Orton was recorded. Foster's widow also identified a photograph of the claimant as Arthur Orton, thus providing the first direct evidence that the claimant might in fact be Orton. In Wagga Wagga, one local resident recalled the butcher Castro saying that he had learned his trade in Wapping. When this information reached London, inquiries were made in Wapping by a private detective, ex-police inspector Jack Butcher, and the claimant's visit in December 1866 was revealed. Arthur Orton, a butcher's son, was born on the 20th of March 1834 in Wapping. He'd gone to sea as a boy and had been in Chile in the 1850s. Sometime in 1852, he arrived in Hobart, Tasmania, on the transport ship Middleton, and later moved to mainland Australia. His employment by Foster at Gippsland terminated around 1857 with a dispute over wages. Thereafter, he disappears. If he was not Castro, there is no further distinct evidence of Orton's existence, although strenuous efforts were made to find him. The claimant hinted that some of his activities with Orton were of a criminal nature, and that to confound the authorities, they had sometimes exchanged names. Most of Orton's family failed to recognise the claimant as their long-lost kinsman, although it was later revealed that he'd paid them money. However, a former sweetheart of Orton's, Mary Ann Loder, did identify the claimant as Orton. Lady Tichborne died on the 12th of March 1868, thus depriving the claimant of his principal advocate and his main source of income. He outraged the family by insisting on taking the position of chief mourner at her funeral mass. His lost income was rapidly replaced by a fund set up by supporters that provided a house near Ayersford and an income of £1,400 a year, or £145,000 a year in today's money. In September 1868, together with his legal team, the claimant went to South America to meet face-to-face with potential witnesses who might confirm his identity. He disembarked in Buenos Aires, ostensibly to travel to Valparaiso over land and rejoin his advisors, who were continuing by sea. After waiting 2 months in Buenos Aires, he caught a ship home. His explanations for the sudden retreat, poor health, and dangers from brigands did not convince his backers, many who withdrew their support. Holmes resigned as his solicitor. Furthermore, on their return, his advisors reported that no one had heard of Tichborne, although they remembered a young English sailor called Arturo. The claimant was now bankrupt. In 1870, his new legal advisor launched a novel fundraising scheme. Tichborne bonds, an issue of 1,000 debentures of £100 face value, the holders of which would be repaid with interest when the claimant obtained his inheritance. Around £40,000 was raised, although the bonds quickly traded at considerable discount and were soon being exchanged for dizzy amounts. The scheme allowed the claimant to continue to meet his living and legal expenses for a while. After a delay, while the Franco-Prussian War and its aftermath prevented key witnesses from leaving Paris, the civil case that the claimant hoped would confirm his identity finally came to court in May 1871. Join me next week for part 2 of the Tichborne case, and until then, bye bye.